there you go. And you have also interpretation available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. So you can select your preferred language by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom right of your screen. Also a gentle reminder, if you can please keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking. So welcome all. Now we can get started. My name is Valentina Pavarotti, and I am the Communications Officer at the Agroecology Coalition. We are very proud to co-host today's session with our partners, Land is Life, and you will hear more about them very shortly. As for us, the Agroecology Coalition, our mission is to work to accelerate the transformation of food systems through agroecology. Our approach is grounded in the principles and elements of agroecology. We can move to the next slide where you can see a visual representation of the principles and elements. In case you're not familiar with that, this is also a resource that you can explore on our website. The coalition brings together a network that includes around 50 governments and 320 organizations, roughly, of different kinds, from civil society groups to farmer organizations, indigenous peoples, and philanthropic institutions as well. So today's session will feature a rich discussion. In the next slide, you will see the panel that we'll have today. So I will introduce them one by one later, but you can already see that we have a lot of interesting speakers. And we will start with some opening statements, then we'll have a panel discussion, and then we'll have a Q&A session later on, and we'll have some closing remarks. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any time, and our team will collect them for the Q&A session later on. So you will be able to address them a bit later. We are now very happy to begin with our first opening address with Jemimah Kerenge. She's the Africa Program Director at Land is Life, and she is a member of the Maasai community and has a wealth of experience in community-based development, especially in the areas of land rights, food sovereignty, and climate justice. So over to you, Jemimah.
Thank you so much, Valentina, and thank you all for giving me this floor. We are honored to partner with Agroecology Coalition to highlight the leadership of Indigenous people in transforming a food system. I represent Land's Life, an Indigenous people's coalition that for 33 years has committed to advance the self-determination and collective rights of Indigenous people in the world's 7 social cultural regions. Our topic of discussion today is Indigenous peoples and agroecology, exploring their leadership in transforming food. And the reason why we decided to have this webinar is to explore on how agroecology and Indigenous people's food system can support food sovereignty and ensure food system transformation for healthy and sustainable diets for all while nurturing the planet. It will also share lessons from Indigenous people's knowledge holders, highlight how Indigenous peoples are already leading the way, and emphasize why supporting their food and knowledge system is essential for transforming a global food system. Let me give highlights of Land is Life Food Sovereignty and Security Program. And so through our Indigenous People's Food Sovereignty and Security Program, we support grassroots initiatives that strengthen Indigenous people's food system in sub-Saharan Africa and Mesoamerica. The program is led by Indigenous advisors and responds to the real challenges Indigenous peoples face, whether from climate change, industrial agriculture, or extractive industries. And since 2021, we have supported over 400 Indigenous peoples through Indigenous peoples' organizations. We are especially proud of the leadership of Indigenous women and youth in advancing agroecology, improving household nutrition, and diversifying livelihoods through agroecological practices. We have seen that Indigenous peoples have control of their food system. And one powerful story that we have is from one organization in Tanzania by the name Osiligi Women and Conservation Group, which is in Tanzania. And by embracing small-scale farming, they not only tackled malnutrition, but also created new income sources beyond livestock. Another great story that we had, it comes from Machakos County in Kenya, where our partners, Hakinabiri Africa, introduced agroecology in a primary school, passing on sustainable farming knowledge to the Indigenous youth. And in Nicaragua, after Hurricane Yator, the knowledge and food systems of the Mosquito people were crucial to recover from this climate-related disaster. They restored hectares of land with ecological crops, fruit trees, and native plants, which has brought long-term benefits. And now families can store their own seeds and replant them each season, reinforcing Indigenous people's economies by extending harvest and seeds within and across their communities. These stories remind us that Indigenous people are not just protectors of biodiversity, but leaders in building a resilient and sustainable food system. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jemimah, for this opening. And next, we are pleased to welcome Monicah Yator. She's a human rights defender and activist from the Indigenous Tugen pastoralist community in Baringo, Kenya. And she is the founder of the Indigenous Women and Girls Initiative, and she also serves as the co-chair of the Agroecology Coalition. So today she'll highlight the experience of Baringo and how agroecology strengthens community, especially Indigenous women and girls. So welcome, Monicah, over to you.
Thank you very much. And before I start, allow me to put off my video because of the internet. Sorry. Yes, good evening, good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be here today, joining this vital conversation about how Indigenous communities are leading the way in shaping resilient, just food system. I extend my gratitude to the organizers for bringing us together. As you know, I am an Indigenous from pastoralist community in Baringo, and I have some highlights just to advance agroecology among the Indigenous peoples in Kenya and beyond. So Indigenous knowledge as the bedrock of agroecology. For us, agroecology isn't a new concept. It is a re-emphasis of millennia, Indigenous wisdom. Our ancestors understood living in harmony with nature, diversifying crops, managing water, and respecting local ecosystems. This deep traditional ecological knowledge is the foundation for climate resilient and food systems. Connecting to food sovereignty, it's about communities regaining control over their food, what they grow, how they grow it, and who benefits. This ensures culturally appropriate health diets. Agroecology as a powerful tool, #climate action, mitigation, through practices like establishing food forest. We are actually sequester carbon, restoring degraded lands, and turning them into carbon sinks. We are regreening our ourselves, not just by farming. Adaptation. Agroecology builds inherent resilience. We focus on drought resilient Indigenous crops, smart water harvesting, using swales, terracing, and diversifying biodiversity. This helps our communities withstand erratic rainfall and prolonged droughts, ensuring food is in challenging times, ensuring food security and nutrition from the ground and up. Our food forests and kitchen gardens directly address food insecurity. By providing diverse, nutritious, and consistent food sources, this reduces reliance of external and often expensive food aid. It shifts communities from dependency to self-sufficiency, ensuring children have access to healthy meals, which directly impacts the health and education. Agroecology as a catalyst for gender equality. Women are the primary food producers and knowledge keepers in our communities. Agroecology empowers them by giving them the direct control over food production, reducing their labor burden in fetching water and food, and fostering economic opportunities. At IWGI, we explicitly engage girls and young women through green clubs. They become leaders, decision makers, and environmental stewards, challenging traditional norms and building confidence. This is crucial for future generation climate leadership. Scaling and collaboration lessons from Kenya. Our experience in Baringo shows that school-based food forests are highly replicable and scalable. They become living classrooms and community hubs for change. To go beyond Kenya, we must recognize and invest in Indigenous-led solutions. They are not merely beneficiaries, they are innovators with vital lessons for reshaping global food system towards a healthy, sustainable, and equitable future for all. So I'm really glad to be one of the agroecology champions in Baringo, and I want to be even international, go international and preach this gospel to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Monica, for these inspiring words and for highlighting so clearly the benefits of agroecology in your community. So we're now going to move to the panel section of our webinar. And first, we'll hear from Gratia Dkhar. She's a senior associate at the Northeast Slow Food and Agrobiodiversity Society in India. She specializes in regenerative agriculture and agroecology, integrating indigenous knowledge into sustainable farming practices. Welcome, Gratia. Can you tell us about the TAPE tool and how it supports the integration of indigenous people's food system?
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone, and a warm greetings from Meghalaya, Northeast India. Firstly, we at TIP are really grateful for this opportunity to share on the 2022 and 24 study on Indigenous people's food system that we have undertaken with 500 households that were located in 16 landscapes in northern Thailand, Northeast India, Kenya, and Mexico. The indigenous youth from these participating communities have worked as researcher in this study. So we use the FAO's tool for agroecology performance evaluation, or TAPE, which is a globally endorsed framework that assesses the multidimensional performance of a food system using the 10 elements, based on the 10 elements of agroecology. While reviewing the tool, we immediately recognize that there's a need for refinement of the TAPE methodology to better represent the nuances of indigenous people's food system and the underlying worldviews. So in agreement with FAO's, the Agroecology unit, we introduced key enhancements to the methodology. First, what we did was we adapted the step 0 of TAPE by introducing a PRA tool called the Seasonal Dependency Matrix to allow us to document the seasonal reliance on diverse food systems. We also added an index to capture the food gathered from natural ecosystems such as honey, wild edibles under the element of diversity. Secondly, what we did was we complemented the tool with participatory storytelling to capture the underlying principles and values of caring and sharing that are often overlooked in conventional assessment approaches. These enhancements, it has emerged through the iterative engagement with indigenous communities that included the Yucatec Mayan of Mexico, the Okiek people in Kenya, the Current in northern Thailand, and the Khasi, Garo, and Karbi people in India. So elders, youth, and community researchers, they played a central role to ensure that these processes were intercultural and that the very data collected through TAPE were meaningful to the communities themselves. In fact, the results showed that strong agroecological outcomes is in areas where the indigenous people's food system are still vibrant. There was high crop diversity, soil fertility was sustained, and there was an inclusive participation among community amongst the others that we saw through the findings. This study using the TAPE IP version, it further confirmed that Indigenous people's food system are more than just agriculture, but they represent a mosaic of regenerative landscapes that include cultivated, semi-domesticated, and natural systems, most of which are rain-fed. Yet these systems, they remain marginalized in both research and policy, and the evidence supporting this contribution to sustainability also remains limited and fragmented. What the study also revealed using the TAPE methodology was that human and social values constitute the foundation, which is supported by responsible and reciprocal governance, where food is not just produced for consumption or income, but to nurture ecosystem and uphold the community well-being. Unlike modern systems, which are often transactional and increasingly individualistic, Indigenous people's food system are inherently relational, which connects people, communities, and nature. And what we see is mainstream science have largely focus on quantifiable outputs like yields and incomes, while the embedded relational dimensions that are core to the food systems of Indigenous people are often overlooked. Besides this, we also conducted a study on 18 villages on the level of food insecurity using FAO's the Food Insecurity Experience Scale methodology, or the FIAS methodology. And this study revealed that communities that rely on the traditional food system experience little to no food insecurity. And building from these insights and with the support from Rockefeller Foundation, CS Fund, and others, we have been able to co-develop an outcome framework on how can we scale Indigenous people's food system that would benefit for people, nature, and climate. This framework aligns also with global commitments like the Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Biodiversity Framework, and it provides guidance for a future investment and that are rooted in Indigenous people's values.
Gratia, could you unmute your mic? Something happened with your audio. There you go.
Sorry. I hope I'm audible now. Yeah.
It's good now. Yeah.
So what I was saying is that from the studies also, it shows that Indigenous people's food system have these template of solution for biodiversity conservation, nutrition, nature-based livelihood, and also in building climate resilience. But when we talk about scaling, it must be one that is grounded in Indigenous leadership and ownership and context. And a critical point is that Indigenous people must be recognized as right holders, and the rights for traditional knowledge and natural resources needs to be safeguarded, including the fair benefit sharing for any future application or innovations that would be based on the systems. And to avoid such extractive models that prioritize profit over people and ecosystem, there is a need to foster intercultural co-creation of knowledge, approaches that honor Indigenous ownership, value experiential learning, and integrates scientific methods appropriately. And we believe that such respectful collaboration, as we have done with using of the TAPE tool, will offer clear pathways towards more equitable, resilient, and nature-based futures for all. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Gratia, for the very interesting insights in your research. I want to remind everybody that you can start asking your questions in the chat and we will address them later. And we are now going to turn to the government perspective. And joining us is Nayely Martinez Hernandez, the General Director of Agroecological Transition at Mexico Secretariat of Agriculture and Rural Development. She leads national efforts to promote agroecological practices, working in close collaboration with Indigenous communities. Welcome, Nayely. Nayely, are you able to hear? Yes,
Hola,
hi.
buenos días, compañeros y compañeras de la coalición. Voy a hacer, gracias por compartir la presentación. Voy a tratar de ser muy breve. Muchas gracias por la organización del evento, por los esfuerzos de coordinarse con tantas personas de tantos lugares. Bueno, nosotros estamos iniciando este sexenio, le llamamos, ¿no? El gobierno de México administra cada 6 meses su gobierno, 6 años su gobierno, y en este nuevo sexenio se creó en el Ministerio de Agricultura una dirección general de transición agroecológica, ¿no? Entonces, la Dirección General de Transición Agroecológica se encarga de coordinar todo el acompañamiento técnico del gobierno federal con enfoque agroecológico, ¿no? La siguiente, por favor. A ver, la siguiente. Y bueno, nombramos el programa de acompañamiento Cosechando Soberanía, ¿no? Es el nombre que la presidenta instruyó, ese es su programa, y entonces trabajamos en torno a todas estas acciones, ¿no? Para poder alcanzar la soberanía. A ver, permítame, ya, aquí está. Creo que tengo que darle clic aquí, ¿vale? Listo. Bueno, nosotros nos organizamos en escuelas de campo. Son los espacios fundamentales de organización de las escuelas de campo, en donde los productores y productoras se reúnen para dialogar y compartir saberes, ¿no? Es muy importante para nosotros reconocer los saberes de los grupos indígenas. eh, y hay técnicos y técnicas que también son de zonas indígenas y que acompañan a los productores y productoras, ¿no? La siguiente. eh, Al día de hoy, bueno, aquí está el mapa de México. Nosotros nos organizamos en 4.670 escuelas de campo y nos concentramos en la actualidad en 11 cultivos prioritarios, ¿no? En el sexenio pasado trabajamos fundamentalmente con maíz, con milpa, ¿no? Que ya era una diferencia, con miel, pero también incluimos meliponas, ¿no? Trabajamos con afis y también con meliponas. También trabajamos con café, trabajamos con productores de leche, trigo, cacao, y en este nuevo ejercicio agregamos chile, cebolla y jitomate porque impacta muchísimo en la canasta básica, ¿no? En la actualidad estamos acompañando con enfoque agroecológico a 196.501 productores y productoras, casi en todos los estados de la República Mexicana, ¿no? En 27 estados. Y bueno, tenemos la meta para terminando el año poder crear 9.296 escuelas de campo y poder coberturar a 400.000 productores y productoras. A ver la siguiente. Nos preguntaban, ¿no? ¿Cómo es que ustedes se enfocan en los pueblos indígenas? Comentarles que con el cambio de enfoque y de política pública, nosotros priorizamos muchísimo las zonas donde se encuentran núcleos indígenas. Entonces, dentro de las escuelas de campo participan 69.273 personas que se asumen como de pueblos indígenas, ¿no? 1.600 escuelas de campo en donde están dirigiendo grupos indígenas y 308 municipios que se autodenominan principalmente como indígenas, ¿no? Entonces, estamos principalmente en esas zonas acompañando. A ver, la siguiente. Y bueno, no había puesto atención que también cada año el gobierno de México selecciona un tema para celebrar o enfatizar, ¿no? Entonces, este año 2025 es el año de la mujer indígena, ¿no? Entonces, en toda la República y en todas las secretarías, educación, salud, ¿no? Energía y también agricultura, nos enfocamos muchísimo en priorizar y identificar cuáles son las limitaciones para que las mujeres y especialmente las mujeres indígenas puedan acceder como a las mismas oportunidades, ¿no? No solo que los hombres, sino también las mujeres indígenas, ¿no? Y bueno, tenemos identificados todos estos grupos indígenas originarios de México que participan en las escuelas de campo, ¿no? Entonces, tenemos afromexicanos, amuzgos, chinantecos, chocholtecos, huicholes, desde la península, ¿no? Que hace un momento hablaba Gratia de la milpa maya, ¿no? También nosotros acompañamos a campesinos de la península hasta el norte del país, ¿no? Con los yaquis, por ejemplo. A ver la siguiente. Y bueno, ahorita estamos haciendo un esfuerzo importante por vincular a las instituciones de educación, a las universidades interculturales, para que se vinculen también con las escuelas de campo, con los productores y las productoras indígenas y poder hacer una red, ¿no? De trabajo. A ver la siguiente. Y bueno, esta es nuestra metodología de trabajo, ¿no? En medio está el grupo de productores y productoras, que es lo que llamamos escuela de campo, ¿no? Es un espacio donde dialogan, donde hablan, y alrededor de de este diálogo, nosotros trabajamos innovaciones tecnológicas, muy fuertemente el tema de producción de bioinsumos, estandarización de estos bioinsumos, para incrementar la calidad. Trabajamos muchísimo con técnicas agroecológicas sobre todo el sistema de manejo desde la siembra hasta la cosecha, con el almacenamiento de granos. También estamos trabajando sobre mejoramiento genético participativo desde las comunidades y nosotros tenemos muchas vinculaciones con otras secretarías, especialmente con la Secretaría del Trabajo, que tiene un programa que se llama Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro. Y de esa manera se les da becas a los jóvenes para que puedan sumarse a las prácticas en campo y dialoguen con los productores y productoras. Y entonces hay un diálogo de saberes y un diálogo intergeneracional, ¿no? Que promovemos muchísimo. A ver la siguiente. Y bueno, este es cómo se va constituyendo la escuela de campo, ¿no? El técnico llega a los territorios y pregunta quién quiere sumarse para aprender sobre prácticas agroecológicas y la incorporación a estos grupos es voluntaria, ¿no? Eh, Se ponen ejercicios, se experimentan las parcelas y se va creando un grupo que experimenta y que va creciendo y tomando decisiones y poco a poco resolviendo dificultades que en colectivo encuentran, ¿no? En sus territorios. A ver la siguiente. Eh, Tenemos técnicos, hasta el momento tenemos 1.200 técnicos que estamos certificando y que enfatizamos muchísimo en temas sobre producción agroecológica, comercialización, asociatividad, financiamiento y la generación de nuevas innovaciones, ¿no? Pero sobre todo enfatizamos muchísimo en el reconocimiento de los saberes ancestrales, ¿no? La siguiente. Bueno, el proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje, nosotros enfatizamos mucho en la metodología de comunidad de aprendizaje, ¿no? En donde las decisiones se toman en colectivo, ¿no? En los grupos y el técnico acompaña, ¿no? No decide, sino acompaña todos estos procesos, ¿no? Entonces, por eso enfatizamos en ya no usar la palabra extensionismo, sino acompañamiento, ¿no? La siguiente. Y bueno, en relación a lo que acabo de decir, o sea, antes, claro que había un programa de extensionismo en años anteriores, pero ahora tratamos de enfatizar, antes los apoyos se concentraban en productores de gran escala, ahora nos concentramos mucho en productores pequeños y de mediana escala que de acuerdo a la FAO también en esa clasificación es la mayoría de los productores que tenemos en México, ¿no? Productores de pequeña y mediana escala, y también creemos que son los que alimentan al país y al mundo, ¿no? Entonces, a partir de ahí cambió mucho la filosofía y también era nuestra tarea cambiar la filosofía del acompañamiento técnico. Y bueno, tenemos varias plataformas de capacitación virtuales para jóvenes y también para técnicos, ¿no? A ver la siguiente. Bueno, muchas gracias, Vale.
Thank you so much, Nayely, for this very interesting presentation across so many different sectors. And also, I should say thank you for waking up so early in the morning for us. So now we are joined by Alina Saba. She's the project coordinator at the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. And she is an indigenous feminist from the Limbu peoples of the Eastern Hills of Nepal. Welcome, Alina. Your organization recently released a report analyzing funding trends in indigenous peoples' philanthropy. What were the key takeaways from this analysis? So here, yes, you have the presentation up, so over to you.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you so much for inviting IFIP at this very timely webinar. And I'm also very pleased to see many friends and familiar faces. Very pleased to be here. We a little bit about IFIP. We are a network of philanthropic foundations who works to support indigenous peoples organizations globally. And this year we are celebrating the 25th year anniversary, and we work primarily on moving resources to indigenous peoples directly and on redistribution of resources. So based on this, I'm going to talk about today about the two key report that IFIP did looking at the trend of indigenous people's philanthropy, meaning looking at the how much of resources goes to the indigenous peoples or indigenous peoples issues. In the next slide, please. This is important in terms of agroecology because despite being just the almost 6.2% of the people we have been being told, or now it's been well established fact, or we have been like recognized that we hold the 80% of the biodiversity. But if we look at on the other side, most of the indigenous peoples organization or community have very less access to funding to do all the important work that my previous speaker has mentioned before. It is well established fact now that indigenous knowledge, especially in agroecology or sustainable farming, are the ones that are holding the sustainable and healthy food system. But we need more resources to continue to do that and upscale it at the time of this crisis, both climate and environmental crisis. So we looked at some 34,000 grants benefiting indigenous peoples between 2016 and 2020, above $10,000 and tried to figure out what percentage of it were going to indigenous peoples and what issues. And it's really sad to know the state of funding to indigenous peoples, and that is why back to the question of why it is important to fund indigenous peoples. This will answer some of those questions. So next slide, please. So between 2016 and 2020, total value of philanthropy was almost 701.7 billion, but only 0.6% or 4.5 billion went to indigenous peoples globally. And there is also disparity of which region it goes to. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So this is the comparison of what percentage of funding goes to indigenous peoples versus the non-indigenous peoples organization. So it will also give us a clear example of the state of funding to indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. And also there is disparity. We know most of the indigenous peoples living in the developing country needs more resources, are on the front line of impact of climate change. But if we look at the resource distribution, most of them is concentrated in the developed countries, for example, North America, for example, for example, Asia has the least percentage and Africa has the least percentage. So the need versus the resources is flipped. The map is flipped. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are some of the findings from our report that clearly shows the disparity between the channeling of funding distributions. North America receives more than 80% of funding, whereas Asia, Africa, and the Pacific receives the least percentage of funding. And we all know all the organizations who we work, or the indigenous peoples movement, or the movement of agroecology, we know like where are the needs, like where it needs to be channeled. So this poses a question of how much of work that needs to be done. Next slide, please. And I would also like to share some of the key support issues. Environment is also one of the key issues in addition to human rights, education, and health. So this is a little bit of good news here. Next slide, please. And if we look at the data on the environment funding, then we can see, I'm sharing this data just to give an example of like, how does it look like? What does it look like in terms of every year? There is no constant growth, but there is like fluctuation between the key issues. And this kind of help us to give us the overall example of that 0.6% of funding, how much goes to in environment sector. But there are, of course, data gaps, like we don't know yet how much exactly goes to climate, other land, or issue of agriculture or agroecology. Next slide, please. And then we also looked at indigenous women's and funding trend to indigenous women, because we know like indigenous women are the holder of knowledge. They are the stewards of the traditional knowledge that can pass to generations, to future generations. But they are the most vulnerable group, and they are the most minority in terms of access to funding. For example, out of all those total funding, 28.5 billion went to overall grants supporting women and girls. But if we look at specifically, only 1.4%, not even a half billion, went to indigenous women. Next slide, please. And we know there are some barriers, and some of the barriers that has been recognized are most of the funding goes to project support, and they are very short-term or project-based funding, limited access to development of organizational capacity, limited access to major donors or big foundations, complicated grant application processes, strict funding criteria or application processes, and language barriers. So these are the ones, major challenges in terms of accessing funding to indigenous people and indigenous women and indigenous people's organizations. I think the second question to me was, what does it look like for a future trajectory of funding of indigenous peoples? It is hard to say exactly, but if we look at the data from our research, it does show some like in absolute terms, some increase in funding, but there is no standard like percentage of increase. It's quite random. But if we look at it, as you can see here, and the issue of climate change and environment getting the attention now, we can say it is increasing, but the question is also not about amount, but it's also about quality. Who gets to access it, who gets to distribute it, whether indigenous peoples or people working in agroecology sector are able to directly access the funding and control the funding or no. And on the positive note, in the recent times, there has been also an increase in role of indigenous-led funds with a lot of strong advocacy for direct, flexible, and long-term fundings to indigenous peoples. So these are some of our hope, and the strong advocacy around it will lead to increase in funding. But given the crisis that we are facing and the amounts that are being channeled now, there is a lot of work needs to be done. And with this, some of the stark reality of of funding access of or resource distribution to indigenous peoples. I would like to leave it here with questions and also kind of food for thought to all of the concerned stakeholders, especially mainly to the funding community, to why it is really important to work on moving resources to indigenous peoples organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alina, for the very clear picture and all these very interesting data. And I'm now passing the word to María Camila, because with this intervention, we conclude our panel and we can now answer a couple of questions from the audience. So María Camila has been monitoring the chat, so over to you.
Thank you, Valentina. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you for your thoughtful questions and contributions during this session. Well, we have a few questions on the chat. And while we wait for more questions to come in, here's one from Christina Egenter. She says, I have worked for many years to support indigenous communities in Borneo to get their traditional food systems based on agroecological principles recognized and preserved, and we got some significant wins at local level with local government. But when the experience is brought to national level, then the question raised is always that of scale and indigenous food systems not seen as capable of withstanding the issues of scaling up. What are good arguments to counter this narrative of scale in terms of vertical integration and productivity? And many thanks for your wisdom. I believe that this question is for all of the panelists. So I don't know if you would like to answer this one first.
Yeah, if I may take the answers.
Go ahead, Gratia.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I think the challenge of scale is one that is often faced when we're trying to elevate a food system to national recognition. But the very idea of scaling through vertical or integration and industrial replication often does not fit on how agroecology, indigenous food systems and the agroecological system functions. So, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be scaled. But first, we need to understand that these food systems scale differently. It is more towards a horizontal scaling through community to community learning and deeply through knowledge transition and resilience on biodiversity. Now, this is a powerful kind of, it's a scaling, especially in times of climate crisis and food crisis. Now, secondly, you talked about productivity, and the challenge about productivity is that often in the industrial system or the conventional system, productivity often tend to be measured in terms of yield of, say, a single crop per hectare. But if we look at indigenous systems, it provides multiple crops, like it includes wild food, it provides nutrition, it provides ecosystem services. So these are what that feeds in a way that maybe industrial current conventional approach systems does not match. And thirdly, these systems are resilient in that they have been sustaining people for generation, using low external input and a very strong local governance in time of climate instability. And this resilience is also one of the major strengths. And fourthly, your local success that you have shared on Borneo are proof that the systems do work. And the key is rather not to copy them everywhere, not to unify it, but rather to support in their replication that is culturally and ecologically adapted ways. Finally, we look at the global framework where we talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or the Agroecology Initiative of FAO and others. We need to recognize the value of indigenous people's food systems and then was built on the generation of the evidence. As we mentioned, we know that they contribute towards sustainability, but research or policy in these systems are still either fragmented or they are limited for say. So especially if we talk about indigenous systems, which are largely rain-fed agriculture, but what we see is evidence or research on them are still very limited. So the narrative is in that food system, indigenous people's food system cannot be scaled, but it needs to be redefining in the word of scaling in itself so that it fit systems that are sustainable, that are just and deeply rooted in the place where it comes from. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Gratia. And the second question would be from Viveken Yegaran. And it says, thank you for all the work that you're all doing and paving the way forward. Regarding Alina's talk about funding, are you seeing an increase in direct funding models that are finding ways to create more space and agency for grassroots IPLC-led decisions? And how do we navigate the resistance to these types of funding models, since the existing norm is to look to commercialize investments that accommodate the risk-return relationship that people assume are of higher risk in these scenarios? I'm thinking about funds like Agroecology Fund, Forest People's Program, Forest Vision's Donor Prospectus, among others. Thank you, Viveken, for that question. I don't know if Alina wants to answer this one.
Thank you for the question. So I can definitely speak on about the indigenous-led funds or rise on advocacy about the giving direct funding to indigenous peoples or direct, flexible, equitable funding to indigenous peoples from the space of both the biodiversity COP process and UNFCCC COP process. Since COP26, this has been a very established key advocacy issue. And if we look back since then, there has been some gains around this issue, and we are also moving on the second phase of the funding for indigenous peoples placed on for forest, the biggest funding that was established in COP26. So and then if we look at also, as the speakers mentioned before, we know what works, like the climate solutions or the food systems driven by or based on the knowledge of local people, indigenous peoples, is the one that works. And we cannot be running away from this fact. But it's just more about the developing further and strengthening this movement and scaling our work to the wider world, to the policy level, to the respective places and with the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. And I believe that we have time for one more question, and this would be from Amba Jamir. She says, the presentation have made me wonder on what specific policy measures can be implemented to support the integration of indigenous people's traditional knowledge into agroecological frameworks, ensuring both environmental sustainability and the protection of indigenous rights. I don't know which one of you would like to answer this question. Maybe Nayely?
I am afraid Nayely might have left just a minute ago, but I see Monicah has a raised hand.
Great, Monicah, go ahead.
Yes, I want to agree that without a policy, we cannot integrate agroecology and or integrate traditional knowledge or indigenous way of life and values to agroecology. But we have opportunities currently, especially in Kenya, that we have launched a agroecology strategy, a national strategy, and we are now rolling out agroecology policies in every county, and that gives opportunity to indigenous community to interact with this policy and make sure that their issues and also their values is well articulated in those policies. And if you know that every year we have COP meetings, and that is the best way for indigenous communities to express their views during COP sessions, Conference of Parties. And also in the East Africa, we have, they have recently launched East Africa agroecology policy. I think the people coming from Africa who are indigenous people can really say that they have an opportunity to make sure that they integrate their issues in these policies when they come to their territories. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monicah. Well, and one just last question very quickly from Gideon. Well, he asked about what are the current interventions to improve your outreach to fund Indigenous-led organizations who do not have access to internet and digital devices, especially in Africa, which recorded the lowest funding rate. I believe that this question is for Alina.
Yes, just to answer your question on, we have been, so we also advocate for the funding of indigenous peoples, but how to answer that is based on the principle of 5 Rs that we have developed framework and based on that we advocate, and that is on principle of indigenous values, which are redistribution, relationship, respect, reciprocity, etc. And so our goal is to overallly influence the philanthropic sector, saying we need to do what needs, what works, and what are identified by the indigenous peoples in the community directly, and move away from the traditional and conventional system of grant making towards the one which is based on trust, which is based on relationship, and which fosters our relationship directly with indigenous community or indigenous peoples. So perhaps this would help to answer the question by you, if not fully, but in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. And thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of the organization team, I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to all of your speakers for sharing their insights, experience, and expertise. Well, I would like to pass the floor to Leonida to close the session, to make the closing. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much, Camila, and thank you all to the participants who have graced our webinar. What I'd like to say is that agroecology is very, very important, particularly for developing nations, and there is evidence that there is need for more funding, particularly to indigenous people's territories. And the other thing I want to point out is that there's need for more investment in agroecology and also in research, because many a times when you do advocacy work, you're told, where is the evidence? And so we need, there's need for more support in order to carry out agroecology related research. For organizations that are supporting indigenous peoples, it's important to increase the amount of funding, because indigenous peoples are suffering from the ravages of food crisis and also climate crisis. I'd like just to show you evidently what Land is Life has been doing in Africa and why there is this call for action for increased funding. You can see the various photos represented there. Those are evidence of work of Land is Life in different territories in Africa, particularly in East Africa. We have the Batwa community that is in Burundi. We have another photo showing the Ogiek community, the Maasai community in Tanzania, and the Ndorois and the Ogiek, as well as the Sengwer, who are one of the world's remaining forest-dwelling communities. These are communities that still need support, and they still need to be funded. And of course, my other call is for technical support to Indigenous peoples, particularly in terms of being able to capacity build them to be able to write proposals that can actually enable them to get funding. There's also need for funders to be flexible as far as the proposals that Indigenous people from Indigenous communities write because of the inherent challenges that they face. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I'd call upon the funding organizations to continue funding institutions that are working with Indigenous people, for example, Land is Life, and to continue following our activities online, to continue following the work of Land is Life, as well as Agroecology Coalition, to continue partnering with us. If you need more information, just get online and you will find as much information as possible. Let's keep this conversation going. This is just the beginning of unpacking Indigenous people's issues. Thank you very much. Back to you, Camila.
Thank you, Leonida. So as we close, let's remember that this dialogue doesn't end here, and we encourage you to stay engaged and continue connecting to the next events and webinars that we are going to get out. So thank you very much all for your participation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.